In the glittering world of Manhattan's elite, some secrets are sealed with wealth, others with power, and the darkest with blood. This is the story of Jericho Slade, a billionaire who thought he had everything. A sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park, a name that commanded respect, and a beautiful, fragile wife he could break whenever he pleased. But he never once questioned why his sickly wife Estelle never flinched at the sight of a needle, or how her pulse remained steady even under his most terrifying threats. He was about to learn that the woman he tormented daily wasn't just his wife. She was a ghost, an instrument of death in hiding, and he had just given her a reason to come back to life. The penthouse apartment was a testament to sterile, exorbitant wealth. It occupied the entire top floor of one of Manhattan's most prestigious buildings, a glass-walled palace in the sky where the city sprawled below like a diamond-dusted carpet. To the outside world, this was the home of Jericho Slade, the charismatic CEO of Slade Global, and his beautiful, perpetually ill wife, Estelle. It was a picture of success and devotion, carefully curated for the pages of Forbes and Vanity Fair. Inside, it was a prison. Estelle stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection a pale, slender silhouette against the vibrant sunset. She was dressed in a simple, cream-colored cashmere dress that hung loosely on her frame, making her look even more fragile than she already was. Her long, dark hair was tied back in a loose knot, and her face, devoid of makeup, was classically beautiful, but etched with a weariness that went beyond her supposed chronic illness. She traced the condensation on the cold glass with a fingertip, her breathing slow and even, a practiced calm that had become her only shield. The sound of the private elevator door hissing open broke the silence. The cadence of the footsteps that followed was all too familiar. One set sharp, heavy, and impatient. Jericho's. The other, a staccato click-clack of stilettos that belonged to his mistress, Victoria Devereaux. Estelle didn't turn. She kept her eyes on the fading light, her posture unchanged. She had learned that reacting was a form of currency, and she refused to give them anything of value. "Still moping by the window, darling?" Jericho's voice was smooth, a rich baritone that charmed boardrooms and disarmed investors. Here in their home, it was laced with a chilling disdain. He came to stand behind her, his expensive cologne, a cloying mix of sandalwood and entitlement, washing over her. "You'd think for the amount of money I spend on your doctors, you'd at least have the energy to greet your husband." Victoria, a bombshell with fiery red hair and a dress that looked sprayed onto her surgically perfected body, glided into the room. She draped herself over a white leather sofa, crossing her long legs with a theatrical sigh. Her eyes, the color of shrewd emeralds, scanned Estelle with unconcealed contempt. "Leave her be, Jules," Victoria said, her voice a purr. "She's probably contemplating which new, exotic disease she'll develop next week. Is it Peruvian fainting syndrome this time? Or perhaps Victorian consumption?" Jericho chuckled, a low, cruel sound. He placed his hands on Estelle's shoulders, his grip just a little too tight. "She's a work of art, isn't she? So delicate, so breakable." His thumb pressed into the sensitive junction of her neck and shoulder, a casual display of ownership and threat. Estelle's heart rate remained a steady 60 beats per minute. Her breathing did not hitch. Inside, a cold, dark river flowed, a part of her she had locked away for years. She was a dormant volcano, and they were carelessly dancing on the crater's edge. She had been trained to withstand pain far greater than a bully's grip. She knew 12 different ways to use his own thumb to shatter his larynx, but she remained still. The mission wasn't over. Survival was the mission. "I was just enjoying the view," Estelle said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. It was the voice they expected, the voice of a victim. "The view!" Jericho scoffed, releasing her and walking towards the bar. "The view is for people who do things, who conquer. You just exist." He poured himself a generous measure of whiskey, the amber liquid glinting in the dimming light. He then poured another, handing it to Victoria, who accepted it with a triumphant smirk. Victoria took a sip. "We had the most incredible day, Estelle. We closed the Nakatomi deal. The board was eating out of Jericho's hand." She looked pointedly at Estelle. I was there, of course. Someone has to make sure he's taken care of, that his tie is straight, that his public image is perfect. It's a full-time job, keeping a titan like him at the top. The implication was clear. I do the job you're too sick and useless to do. Estelle finally turned from the window, her gaze sweeping over them. It was a placid, almost vacant look, but behind it, she was cataloging everything. Victoria's dress, a bright crimson, would make her an easy target in low light. The stiletto heels were a liability, easily broken, a potential weapon. Jericho's watch, a Patek Philippe, was heavy enough to crack a skull if swung with enough force. The observations were automatic, a deeply ingrained part of her that she could never erase. That's wonderful, Jericho. Congratulations, she said, her voice perfectly modulated to convey wifely pride. He sneered. Don't pretend you understand what it means. It means I just made more money in an afternoon than your family has seen in 3 generations. He downed his whiskey in one gulp and slammed the crystal tumbler down on the marble countertop. The sound cracked through the room. And we're going to celebrate, Victoria announced, standing up and slinking towards him. She ran a perfectly manicured hand down his chest. We've booked a table at Perse, the private room. She paused, turning her venomous gaze back to Estelle. Don't wait up. In fact, why don't you have one of your nurses give you a sedative? A nice long sleep. You need your rest after all. Jericho wrapped his arm around Victoria's waist, pulling her flush against him. He looked at his wife, a woman he had married for her prestigious family name and her docile beauty, and saw nothing but a burden. Yes, Estelle, go to bed. The adults have things to do. They laughed as they walked back to the elevator, their arms around each other, a portrait of arrogant betrayal. The doors slid shut, and Estelle was once again alone in the silent, opulent cage. She stood motionless for a full minute, her eyes closed. The mask of the frail, sick wife did not slip. Not yet. But the cold river inside her began to flow a little faster. She walked not to her bedroom, but to the small, soundproofed home gym Jericho had installed for his own use. Ignoring the state-of-the-art treadmills and weight machines, she went to a simple pull-up bar. She reached up, her hands gripping the cold metal. With a smooth, controlled motion, she pulled herself up, her chin clearing the bar with ease. She held the position, her muscles coiled with a power that would have shocked anyone who saw her. There was no strain on her face, only a deadly focus. 1 pull-up, 2, 10, 20. Her body, the one Jericho and Victoria saw as a fragile vessel of sickness, was a finely tuned weapon. The chronic illness was a masterpiece of deception, a long con played with herbs that mimic symptoms, beta blockers to keep her heart rate artificially low, and an acting performance worthy of an Oscar. She was hiding in plain sight, in the last place anyone would ever think to look for, the Nightingale, a phantom assassin who had vanished from the world's intelligence agencies 5 years ago. She had wanted a normal life, a quiet life, away from the blood and the shadows. She had thought marrying Jericho Slade, a man of wealth and public stature, would be the perfect cover. She had mistaken his arrogance for strength, his possessiveness for passion. She had been wrong. Dropping lightly to the floor, her feet making no sound, she walked back into the living room. Victoria had deliberately left her lipstick-stained glass on a priceless antique side table, a small act of territorial defiance. Estelle picked it up. She looked at the crimson smear on the crystal. A name echoed in the silence of her mind, a name from her past, her handler. Emotion is a liability, Faye, a weapon your enemy will always use against you. Her name wasn't Estelle, it was Faye, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt the ice around her heart begin to crack. Not with pain or sadness, but with a cold, clear, and terrifying rage. Jericho and Victoria thought they were celebrating a business deal. They had no idea they were celebrating the beginning of their end. The Nightingale was starting to remember how to sing. 2 weeks later, the annual Slade Global Foundation Gala was in full swing. It was the pinnacle of the New York social calendar, a night where old money and new tech collided in a sea of champagne, couture, and performative philanthropy. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was dripping with crystal and orchids, a backdrop for the city's most powerful figures. Jericho was in his element. He moved through the crowd like a shark, a charming smile fixed on his face, shaking hands with senators and tech moguls, his every move projecting power. Victoria was at his side, a vision in emerald green silk, playing the part of the devoted partner to perfection. She was the power behind the throne, and she made sure everyone knew it. Estelle was expected to be there, of course. It was part of the charade. She was the sick, beautiful wife, an object of pity and a testament to Jericho's noble character for standing by her. She was seated at the main table, a ghost in a gown of pale silver that made her look ethereal and translucent. She sipped her water, offered quiet, tired smiles, and occasionally pressed a delicate hand to her temple, a subtle performance of her chronic fatigue. From her vantage point, she saw everything. She noted the security details, their positions, their weapons, the subtle bulges under their tuxedos. She saw the rival CEOs watching Jericho with envious eyes, the journalists hungry for a scoop, the wives sizing each other up. It was a different kind of battlefield from the ones she knew, but the principles were the same. Identify the threats, know the exits, and control the narrative. "You're looking especially pale tonight, darling," Jericho murmured, leaning over her as he briefly returned to the table. His breath smelled of expensive wine. "Try not to collapse before my speech. It would be terribly off-brand." "I'll do my best," she replied, her voice a soft melody of submission. Victoria, who had followed him, placed a hand on his arm. "Don't worry, Jules. If she faints, I'll catch her. We can't have her ruining your big night." Her smile was pure acid. Estelle simply inclined her head, her eyes downcast. But as they moved away, her gaze lifted, cool and calculating. She watched them work the room, their laughter echoing. She saw the way Victoria's hand lingered on Jericho's back, a clear signal of intimacy. She saw the way he whispered in her ear, his eyes crinkling in a way they never did for his wife. They were so confident, so brazen in their betrayal. Later, during Jericho's keynote address, a self-aggrandizing speech about innovation and legacy, Estelle excused herself. She needed a moment, she whispered to a concerned socialite at her table. She didn't go to the powder room. Instead, she slipped through a service corridor, her silver heels making no sound on the tiled floor. The noise of the gala faded behind her, replaced by the clatter of the hotel kitchen and the hum of machinery. She moved with a liquid grace that defied her fragile appearance, her senses on high alert. Her target was not in the ballroom. He was in a private office on the mezzanine level. A man named Roman Petrov, a Russian oligarch and a silent partner in Jericho's Nakatomi deal. Estelle, or rather Faye, knew that the deal wasn't just about technology. It was about laundering money, a river of dark funds flowing from Petrov's illicit operations through Slade Global's legitimate channels. Jericho wasn't just a bully, he was a criminal. And he was using her family's name, the very name he'd married her for, to sanitize his filth. She found the office easily. The lock was a joke, a simple tumbler she could have picked with a bobby pin. She didn't need to. A waiter, his face tight with fear, was just leaving the room. He saw her and flinched, almost dropping his tray. "Ma'am?" "You shouldn't be back here." Faye gave him a small, helpless smile. "I'm so sorry, I think I'm lost. My husband, Jericho Slade. I was just looking for a quiet place to sit for a moment." The waiter's expression softened with pity. "Of course, Mrs. Slade. The ballroom is just back that way." "Thank you," she said, her voice breathy. As he turned, her hand, as fast as a striking snake, shot out and plucked the key card he had just used from his jacket pocket. He never felt a thing. She waited 30 seconds, then swiped the card. The light flashed green, and she slipped inside, closing the door silently behind her. Roman Petrov was sitting at a large mahogany desk, a phone pressed to his ear, barking orders in Russian. He was a thick, brutal-looking man with a shaved head and a broken nose. He didn't notice her at first. Faye took a moment to appreciate the scene. This was her true element: the silence, the tension, the hunt. The sick, weak Estelle was a costume she wore. But Faye, the Nightingale, was who she was. Petrov ended his call and finally saw her. His eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you? How did you get in here?" he growled, his hand instinctively moving to a drawer in his desk. Faye stepped into the light, letting it catch the silver of her dress. She put a hand to her chest in a gesture of feminine fright. "Oh my, I am so terribly sorry. I was looking for the ladies' room." Her voice was Estelle's, soft, fluttering, harmless. Petrov relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained suspicious. "This is a private office. Get out." "Of course," she said, taking a step back toward the door. Then she stopped, her head tilting. "That's a beautiful pen," she said, her eyes fixing on a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen on his desk. "May I?" Before he could answer, she glided forward, her movements impossibly fast. She picked up the pen. Her demeanor shifted in a heartbeat. The frail, lost woman vanished, replaced by a predator. Her eyes, no longer soft and vacant, were now chips of ice. Petrov's eyes widened in shock. He finally realized his mistake. He lunged for the drawer. He was too slow. Faye moved in a blur. She sidestepped his clumsy reach, brought the heavy pen up in a tight, vicious arc, and jammed the pointed end into the carotid artery in his neck. It was a precise, targeted strike, learned and practiced 1,000 times. There was a sickening, wet crunch. Petrov gurgled, his hands flying to his throat. Blood, dark and thick, pulsed from the wound. He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and terror. He tried to speak, but only a choked, gurgling sound came out. He staggered back, knocking over his chair, and collapsed to the floor. Faye watched him die, her expression unreadable. Her pulse was steady. Her breathing was even. She felt nothing. No remorse, no satisfaction. It was simply a task, executed with lethal efficiency. Petrov was a loose end, a threat not just to her, but to the quiet life she had tried to build. Jericho had brought this darkness to her doorstep, and she was going to return it to him, tenfold. She wiped the pen clean on Petrov's jacket and placed it back on the desk, exactly where it had been. She took a tiny, almost invisible listening device from the clasp of her evening bag and affixed it to the underside of the desk. Then, with the same spectral silence, she slipped out of the office, leaving the dead oligarch in a spreading pool of his own dark money. She walked calmly back through the service corridor, her heart a cold, steady drum. As she re-entered the ballroom, the cacophony of the gala washed over her. Jericho was just finishing his speech, his voice booming with false sincerity. "And it is in that spirit of building a better future that I thank you all for your incredible generosity tonight." The room erupted in applause. Jericho stood at the podium, basking in the adoration, a king in his castle. He scanned the crowd and his eyes briefly met Estelle's as she returned to her seat. He gave a slight, dismissive nod, acknowledging her return. She gave him a small, weak smile in return. The perfect, sickly wife. He had no idea that while he was collecting accolades, his ghost of a wife had just committed a perfect murder 100 feet away. He had no idea that the foundation he had built was already beginning to crumble, brought down by the woman he saw as his most fragile, pathetic possession. The gala was a triumph for him, but for Faye, it was just the opening move in a game he didn't even know he was playing. The hunt had begun. The death of Roman Petrov sent a shockwave through the city's underbelly. Though on the surface it was reported as a tragic, unsolved robbery gone wrong. The official narrative was clean. A powerful man, a victim of random urban violence. There were no witnesses, no forced entry, and the only thing missing was his wallet, a clever touch Faye had added by taking it and disposing of it in a trash can miles away. The police were baffled. Jericho Slade, however, was not baffled. He was terrified. He locked himself in his home office, the one with the panoramic view of a city that suddenly felt hostile. The bug Faye had planted under Petrov's desk was now useless, but the one she'd placed under Jericho's own desk weeks ago was a goldmine. She sat in her darkened bedroom, a state-of-the-art receiver hidden in a hollowed-out copy of War and Peace, listening to her husband's world unravel. "It can't be a coincidence," he yelled into his phone. His voice, usually so controlled, was raw with panic. "Roman is dead, the night of the gala, in my hotel. This wasn't a robbery, this was a message?" Faye listened, a faint, cold smile gracing her lips. The man on the other end of the line was likely one of Petrov's lieutenants, someone equally panicked. Security is looking at the tapes, Jericho continued, pacing furiously. They said a waiter was in the corridor, and some woman. My God! He stopped pacing. The silence crackled with his dawning horror. They said she looked lost. A guest. Faye's smile widened. She had worn the perfect camouflage. His own wife. No one would ever suspect the fragile Mrs. Slade. His next call was to Victoria. Something's wrong, he said, his voice low and urgent. Petrov is dead. What? Victoria's voice, tinny through the receiver, was sharp with alarm. How? Where? At the gala. They're calling it a robbery, but I know better. Someone is sending me a message, Tori. Someone knows about our arrangement. Don't be paranoid, Jules, she snapped, though a tremor of fear was evident in her tone. It was probably just some junkie. This is New York. It has nothing to do with us. A junkie doesn't get into a locked office on a private floor during a high-security event, he roared. Think! Who knows? Who would have the nerve? Faye listened as they spiraled, their conversation a frantic dance of accusation and denial. They suspected their rivals, Petrov's other associates, everyone but the silent, pale figure who walked the halls of their own home. Their guilt was a prism, refracting their fear onto every person in their orbit except the one who was actually responsible. Over the next few days, the change in Jericho was palpable. The smug arrogance was replaced by a tense, jittery paranoia. He snapped at his staff, triple-checked the locks on the doors, and hired a new, more expensive security detail. He started watching Estelle too, but not with suspicion. He watched her with a renewed, almost vicious contempt. Her perceived weakness, her constant state of illness, now seemed to mock his own unraveling control. One evening, he stormed into the living room where Estelle was reading. He'd been drinking. She could smell it from across the room. Look at you, he spat, gesturing at her with his glass of whiskey. Sitting there, so calm, so useless. Do you have any idea what's happening in the real world? The pressure I'm under? Estelle slowly lowered her book. Is everything all right, Jericho? She asked, her voice the epitome of gentle concern. No, everything is not all right. He slammed the glass down, whiskey sloshing onto a white rug. My world is on fire, and you just sit there, breathing my expensive air. You're a leech, you know that? A beautiful, pathetic leech. Victoria entered, drawn by the noise. She stood by Jericho's side, a united front of cruelty. He's right, you know, she said to Estelle. He's out there fighting dragons, and what do? You cultivate new symptoms. Maybe you should try to be useful for once. A supportive wife might ask what's wrong. She might try to help. Faye looked from one to the other. It was time to gently stoke the fire. I did ask, she said softly, her eyes wide and innocent. I asked if everything was all right. She turned her gaze to Jericho. Is it about Mr. Petrov? I saw his name in the news. It's so tragic. Did you know him well? The effect was instantaneous. Jericho's face went white. He stared at her, his eyes wide with a new, terrifying thought. How did she know that name? He'd never mentioned it to her. The news, she added quickly, as if sensing his panic. It was in the Financial Times. They said he was a partner in the Nakatomi venture. I thought it might be related to your stress. She made herself look smaller, more fragile. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have pried. It was a masterful stroke. She had given him the answer, but the seed of doubt was planted. Victoria stared at her, her lips curled into a snarl. She saw it not as a lucky guess, but as a pathetic attempt to seem relevant. Oh, so now you're reading the Financial Times? Victoria mocked. What's next? A subscription to The Economist? Don't pretend you understand their world, little girl. You're nothing but a pretty decoration. Jericho, however, was still rattled. He looked at Estelle, truly looked at her, for the first time in a long time. He saw the frail woman, the trembling hands, the downcast eyes. It couldn't be. The idea was absurd. It was just a coincidence. He forced a harsh laugh. Of course, the news. He grabbed Victoria's arm. Come on, I need a real drink. I'm tired of this mausoleum. They left, leaving Estelle alone once more. The mask stayed in place until the elevator doors closed. Then the corner of her mouth twitched. She had just tested the waters, and the result was perfect. He was spooked. His paranoia, now festering, would make him sloppy. And when he was sloppy, he would make mistakes. She knew Jericho's greatest weakness wasn't his cruelty or his criminality. It was his ego. He could not fathom that someone he considered so profoundly beneath him could ever be a threat. He was looking for dragons in the boardroom, never suspecting the viper coiled at his own hearth. And that was exactly where the Nightingale wanted him to be looking. The plan was to dismantle his empire from the inside out. But Faye knew that to do that, she needed to first amplify the chaos. She needed to make Jericho feel like he was losing his mind, to turn his own home into a house of psychological horrors. She started small. A file moved on his desk, a book slightly out of place on his shelf, the temperature in his office inexplicably dropping a few degrees. They were tiny, insignificant things, easily dismissed as oversights or glitches, but they began to accumulate, a steady drip, drip, drip on his already frayed nerves. He would storm out of his office, convinced his cleaning staff had been snooping. "Who touched my desk?" he would roar, his voice echoing in the vast apartment. The staff, terrified, would swear they hadn't. He would check the security logs, which, thanks to Faye's expert slicing, showed nothing. Then she escalated. She started using her knowledge from the bug. Jericho would have a confidential phone call about a potential business vulnerability, and the next morning, an anonymous tip would be sent to a financial blogger from a disposable email address. The information was never direct enough to be traced back, but it was specific enough to cause damage, to spook investors, to force Jericho into frantic damage control. His paranoia began to consume him. He started suspecting everyone: his partners, his board members, his lawyers. He put a new bug-sweeping team on retainer, a high-tech crew who came in once a week. They never found anything. Faye's devices were military-grade, designed to be undetectable by commercial equipment. The cleaners she hired were, in fact, her own people, former assets she could trust, who helped her manage her subtle campaign of gaslighting. Victoria, meanwhile, was growing increasingly impatient with his obsession. "You're losing it, Jericho," she told him one night, her voice sharp. They were in the living room. Faye was supposedly asleep, but she was listening to every word from the next room. "You're so consumed with these ghosts that you're letting the business suffer. The board is talking. They think you're becoming unstable. Don't you see? It's all connected," he insisted, his eyes wild. "Petrov, the leaks, the things moving in my own office. Someone is playing a game with me." "Or maybe you're just cracking under the pressure," she retorted coldly. "Maybe you're not the man I thought you were." The barb hit its mark. Jericho's ego, his most vulnerable point, was wounded. "How dare you?" he seethed. "I built this city. I built you." "You built nothing but a house of cards," she shot back, "and it's starting to wobble." This was the moment Faye had been waiting for, the moment their toxic alliance began to fracture. It was time for the centerpiece of her psychological attack. It was time to give Jericho a real ghost to be afraid of. The next evening, Jericho was working late in his office. Victoria was out at some social event, eager for a respite from his dark moods. Estelle had retired to her room early, complaining of a migraine. The apartment was silent. Faye, dressed in all black, moved like a shadow. She went to the master control panel for the apartment's complex smart home system, a panel hidden behind a modern art installation in the hallway. She had sliced into it months ago. In his office, Jericho was staring at stock tickers, a scowl on his face. Suddenly the lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness, save for the glow of his computer monitors. "Damn it," he muttered, reaching for his phone to call building maintenance. Before he could dial, a soft sound drifted from the living room. Music, a slow, haunting melody from a piano. Jericho froze. His blood ran cold. The piano was a self-playing model, but it was programmed to play upbeat jazz, not this funeral dirge. He stood up slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. Silence. The music stopped. He grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from his desk, his hands slick with sweat. He crept out of his office and into the vast, dark living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the glittering city lights, but they offered no comfort. They only made the shadows in the room seem deeper, darker. The piano was silent. No one was there. He let out a shaky breath. It must have been a system glitch, a power surge. His nerves were shot. He was imagining things. Then he saw her. For a split second, a figure stood at the far end of the room, silhouetted against the window. It was a woman in a pale, shimmering dress, a silver dress, just like the one Estelle had worn to the gala. "Estelle," he whispered, his voice cracking. The figure turned its head, and for a terrifying instant, he thought he saw her face, pale, tragic, and streaked with what looked like tears of blood. He cried out, stumbling backward, dropping the paperweight. It shattered on the marble floor. He squeezed his eyes shut, and when he opened them again, she was gone. The lights flickered back on. The room was empty. The paperweight lay in pieces on the floor. It was impossible. It had to be a hallucination, a stress-induced waking nightmare. But it had felt so real. What he didn't know was that Faye was a master of more than just combat and espionage. She was a master of psychological warfare. The ghost was a high-resolution projection, a technology she had acquired from her past life, deployed from a tiny, hidden device. The music was channeled through the Sonos system. The entire event had lasted less than 10 seconds, but it was enough. Jericho scrambled for his phone and called Victoria. "She was here," he babbled, his voice hysterical. "A ghost in our apartment." "Jericho, stop it!" Victoria's voice was cold, furious. "I'm at a charity dinner. You cannot call me with this nonsense. Pull yourself together, or so help me God, I will walk away from you and this entire mess." The line went dead. Jericho stood alone in his magnificent, empty apartment, trembling. For the first time, the fear he felt wasn't about business or money. It was a primal, superstitious terror. He was being haunted. He didn't know by whom or what, but he was starting to believe that some sins, some betrayals, follow you from beyond the grave. In her room, Faye dismantled the projector. Her face was calm, her hands steady. She had not laid a single hand on him, yet she had struck a deeper blow than any physical assault. She had cracked the foundation of his sanity. And a man who cannot trust his own mind is a man who is already defeated. He just doesn't know it yet. Jericho's haunting was the tipping point. His paranoia curdled into a full-blown obsession. He became a recluse in his own home, jumping at shadows, his days a frantic cycle of reviewing security footage and drinking himself into a stupor. His nights were sleepless, spent waiting for the ghostly woman in the silver dress to reappear. She never did, which only made it worse. The anticipation was its own form of torture. Victoria, seeing her meal ticket and social standing circling the drain, changed tactics. Her contempt for Jericho's weakness was now overshadowed by a desperate need to regain control. If he couldn't run the empire, she would. She began making calls, scheduling meetings behind his back, positioning herself as the stable, rational successor to the increasingly erratic Jericho Slade. Faye watched all of this, a silent puppet master pulling the strings. The bug in Jericho's office was now her window into Victoria's nascent coup. She listened as Victoria spoke to board members, her voice dripping with concern. "I'm worried about him," she'd say. "He's not sleeping. He's talking about apparitions. The pressure is getting to him. The company needs a steady hand right now." It was time for Faye to accelerate the company's demise. She began her whisper campaign. Using encrypted channels and burner phones, she started feeding carefully selected information to a notoriously aggressive financial journalist, a man named Ben Carter, known for his ability to smell blood in the water from miles away. The first leak was about the Nakatomi deal. She didn't reveal the money laundering, not yet. She started with something simpler, something that would raise questions about Jericho's judgment. She leaked the fact that Roman Petrov was under unofficial investigation by Interpol at the time of the deal, a fact Jericho had known and willfully ignored. Ben Carter's column was explosive. "Slade Global's billion-dollar handshake with the Russian mob?" the headline screamed. The article was filled with innuendo and carefully worded questions, all pointing to Jericho's recklessness. Slade Global's stock shuddered, dipping a few points. Jericho, when he saw the article, flew into a rage. "Victoria!" he bellowed, storming into the living room where she was on the phone, no doubt with another board member. He threw the tablet down on the coffee table. "This is your fault. You and your power plays. You're leaking things to make me look bad." "My fault!" she shrieked, jumping to her feet. "You're the one who got into bed with men like Petrov. You're the one who's seeing ghosts. I'm trying to save this company from you." Their fights became the new soundtrack of the penthouse. Vicious, loud, and increasingly public. The staff heard everything, and the staff talked. Faye's next leak to Ben Carter was more surgical. It was a series of internal emails, heavily redacted to protect her identity as the source, showing Jericho overriding his risk assessment team's warnings about a new venture in South America. The project was failing spectacularly, losing the company millions, a fact Jericho had been desperately trying to hide from the board. The new headline was brutal. "King Slade's Folly, Leaked Emails Show, CEO Gambled and Lost Millions." The stock didn't just dip this time, it plunged. Investors panicked. The board called an emergency meeting. Jericho was summoned, but he was in no state to attend. He was a disheveled, paranoid wreck, unshaven and reeking of whiskey. Victoria went in his stead. This was her moment, the one she had been planning for. She stood before the board, a picture of strength and composure. She painted a portrait of a brilliant man crumbling under stress, a tragic hero who had lost his way. She presented her solution: place Jericho on an indefinite medical leave and appoint her as interim CEO. "I can stabilize the ship," she argued, her voice resonating with confidence. "I know his vision, but I do not share his current instability. I can restore investor confidence." Faye listened to the meeting via the bug she'd planted on Victoria's phone. She had to admire the woman's audacity. She was a piranha, and she was stripping Jericho's legacy from his bones while he was still alive. The board, desperate to stop the bleeding, agreed. Jericho was officially sidelined. Victoria Devereaux, his mistress, was now in control of his billion-dollar empire. When Victoria returned to the penthouse that evening, she found Jericho sitting in the dark, a bottle of vodka on the table beside him. "They did it," he slurred, looking up at her. "They pushed me out." "It's for your own good, Jules," she said, her voice devoid of any real sympathy. It was the voice of a victor. "You need to rest. Get better." "You did this," he whispered, his voice cracking with a broken, dawning realization. "This was you. All of it." "I did what was necessary," she replied coolly, walking to the bar to pour herself a celebratory glass of champagne. "I saved the company. Your company." She took a sip, her eyes gleaming over the rim of the glass. "Or rather, my company, now." The look on his face was a portrait of utter devastation. He had been betrayed, not by a ghost or a business rival, but by the one person he thought was his partner in crime. The irony was devastating. From the doorway of her bedroom, Estelle watched them, a silent observer to the carnage she had orchestrated. She looked pale and frail, leaning against the doorframe as if for support. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. Victoria turned, a triumphant sneer on her face. "Your husband has taken a much-needed vacation. I'm in charge now." She looked Estelle up and down with utter disdain. "Things are going to be different around here. I'm redecorating, starting with getting rid of all the dead weight." The threat was unmistakable. Estelle's protection, as flimsy as it had been, was gone. Jericho was no longer the master of the house. A new queen had been crowned, and she had no use for the sickly, inconvenient wife of her predecessor. Estelle simply nodded, her eyes downcast, and retreated into her room. Victoria laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed in the cavernous apartment. She thought she had won. She thought the game was over. She had no idea that for Faye, the real game was just beginning. She had successfully isolated her targets from each other. She had dismantled their power structure. Now they were vulnerable. Now they were exposed. And now the Nightingale could finally stop whispering and start to sing her deadliest song. With Jericho neutered and Victoria in the CEO's chair, the penthouse transformed. The cold, sterile opulence was replaced by Victoria's gaudy, flamboyant taste. She was throwing parties, courting the media, and solidifying her grip on power. She treated Jericho like a pathetic piece of furniture and Estelle like an insect to be crushed. Her favorite new pastime was psychological torment. She would cancel Estelle's long-standing doctor's appointments without telling her, claiming the doctors were quacks, and she was saving money. She would instruct the kitchen staff to prepare foods Estelle was supposedly allergic to, then mock her for not eating. "You have to get over these childish fantasies, Estelle," she'd say at the dinner table, in front of a seething but powerless Jericho. "It's all in your head. A little gluten won't kill you." Faye played her part beautifully. She appeared flustered, frightened, and increasingly unwell. The more Victoria pushed, the more fragile she seemed. It was a dangerous dance. She was goading a predator, pushing her towards a fatal mistake. The mistake came, as Faye knew it would, from Victoria's arrogance. Victoria, in her bid to purge the company of Jericho's loyalists, had scheduled a complete system audit of Slade Global's financials. She wanted to find any hidden accounts or slush funds Jericho might have squirreled away. She had no idea what she was about to uncover. Faye knew the company's servers held the unredacted truth of the Nakatomi deal. The real truth. Not just that Petrov was under investigation, but that the entire venture was a front for a massive international money laundering ring. And buried even deeper in the encrypted subfolders was the real prize, the ledger. A detailed account of every illegal transaction, every bribe, every dirty dollar that had passed through Slade Global. It was Jericho's insurance policy, and Victoria was about to trip over it. Faye could have erased the files. It would have been simple, but that wasn't the plan. The plan wasn't just to escape. The plan was to burn it all to the ground. The auditors found it on a Tuesday. The call from the lead auditor to Victoria was frantic. Faye listened in, her expression serene. "Ms. Devereaux," the man stammered, "we have a problem, a significant problem. We've uncovered encrypted ledgers. The numbers are... This isn't just creative accounting. This is racketeering. This is federal prison-level crime." Victoria's blood ran cold. She had been so focused on ousting Jericho that she never considered the rot might have penetrated the entire foundation. Her name was on the company now. His crimes were now her crimes. Panic set in. She called her lawyer, who gave her stark, terrifying advice. "Destroy it. Destroy it all. If the FBI gets this, you're finished." That evening, Victoria came home in a state of barely controlled hysteria. She found Jericho in the study, staring blankly at a television screen. "You!" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You fool! You didn't just build a company, you built a criminal enterprise. The auditors found the ledgers." Jericho looked at her, a flicker of his old cruel amusement in his eyes. "My ledgers? Oh dear, that is a problem, isn't it? And with your signature on everything now, it looks like it's your problem." He seemed to relish her terror. Misery loved company. "We have to destroy the servers," she said, pacing furiously. "Tonight, before the auditors file their official report." "And how do you plan to do that?" he scoffed. "Walk into the most secure data center in Manhattan with a hammer?" "No," she said, her eyes landing on Estelle, who had just entered the room with a tray of tea, the picture of domestic servitude. Victoria's eyes narrowed, and a truly despicable idea began to form. "We create a diversion," Victoria said slowly, a venomous smile spreading across her face. "A tragedy, something to draw all the attention away, to give us time to wipe the data." She looked directly at Estelle. "A terrible, tragic accident." Jericho stared at her, his drunken brain slowly processing her meaning. "What are you saying?" Victoria walked over to Estelle, who stood frozen, holding the tea tray. Victoria reached out and caressed Estelle's cheek, a gesture of mock affection that was terrifying in its insincerity. "Poor, sick Estelle," Victoria cooed. "Her illness has been so hard on her. She's so confused, so depressed." She looked back at Jericho. A desperate, heartbroken wife. A tragic overdose. It would be so sad, so distracting. The air in the room grew thick and cold. Jericho looked from his calculating mistress to his terrified-looking wife. He had abused Estelle, tormented her, But this was a new level of evil, and yet he was trapped. The ledgers would destroy him as surely as they would destroy Victoria. Faye's heart was beating a steady, lethal rhythm. This is it, the moment she had been working towards. They were finally going to cross the line from which there was no return. Estelle, her hands trembling, dropped the tea tray. It crashed to the floor, shattering the porcelain cups. "No," she whispered, her eyes wide with perfectly feigned terror. "Please." "It's the only way, Jericho," Victoria said, her voice a hard, sharp whisper. "It's her or us." Jericho stood up, his face a mask of conflict. He looked at Estelle, cowering on the floor amidst the broken china, the very picture of a helpless victim. He had long since stopped seeing her as a person. She was a thing, a possession, a problem, and Victoria was offering a final solution. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Do it." That night they came for her. They thought she was asleep. Victoria had crushed a lethal dose of sleeping pills into a glass of water and forced Estelle to drink it earlier, holding her down while Jericho watched, his face ashen. They had carried her to her bed and left her to die. Now, hours later, they returned to the room to ensure the job was done. Victoria had a syringe in her hand, filled with an air bubble, a final, untraceable way to stop a heart if the pills hadn't worked. They opened the door to her bedroom. It was dark. The only sound was the hum of the city outside. "Is she?" Victoria whispered. Jericho reached for the light switch. "Don't," a voice said from the darkness. It was not Estelle's voice. This voice was not soft or frail. It was cold, clear, and resonant with absolute authority. It was the voice of Faye. Jericho and Victoria froze, their hearts seizing in their chests. "Who's there?" Jericho stammered. The light from the hallway silhouetted a figure sitting calmly in an armchair in the corner of the room. It was Estelle's body, but the posture was all wrong. She wasn't slumped or sick. She was sitting upright, her hands resting calmly on the armrests, like a queen on a throne. "You came to see if I was dead," the voice continued, devoid of any emotion. "The answer is no." She rose from the chair, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that was utterly alien. She stepped out of the shadows and into the dim light. Her eyes, no longer downcast or vacant, were glowing with a terrifying intensity. She looked from the syringe in Victoria's hand to the fear on Jericho's face. "The pills were a nice touch," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "A bit amateur, but I appreciate the effort." She took a step closer. "My turn." Victoria, snapping out of her shock, shrieked and lunged, aiming the syringe at Faye's heart. What happened next was too fast for Jericho's terrified mind to process. Faye's arm shot out, not to block, but to redirect. She caught Victoria's wrist, twisted it with an audible snap, and used her momentum to slam her into the wall. Victoria screamed, a sound of pure agony as the bone in her arm broke. The syringe flew from her grasp. Faye caught it. She turned to Jericho, who was paralyzed with a terror so profound it had stolen the air from his lungs. He was staring at his wife, but it wasn't his wife. This was a stranger, a monster. "Who? What are you?" he breathed. Faye smiled, but it was a terrifying sight, all teeth and no warmth. It was the smile of a predator that knows the hunt is finally over. "My name," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "is Faye, and you should have let me sleep." And there, in the wreckage of their own making, Jericho and Victoria finally understood the truth. They weren't dealing with a sick, fragile woman. They had been living with a sleeping tiger. The rest of their story is one of precise, calculated revenge, where every asset was stripped, every secret exposed, and every last shred of their power was systematically annihilated by the ghosts they created. It's a chilling reminder that the people we underestimate are often the most dangerous of all. If this story of deception and revenge sent a chill down your spine, make sure you hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a good twist. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story about the dark secrets hidden beneath the surface of our world. We have more tales of betrayal and justice coming your way.